We are on.
Bonjour. Good day to everyone in Canada and overseas. I am Secretary General Guterres, Chair of the Africa Study Group of the Canadian International Council in Ottawa. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this webinar presented by the Middle East Institute from Washington and the Africa Study Group on the topic Security and Stabilization in Africa, the Sahel. Sécurité et stabilisation en Afrique, le Sahel. I would like to acknowledge that we are hosting this international session from Ottawa on the traditional unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. Je tiens à souligner que nous tenons cette session internationale à partir d'Ottawa, territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple Anishinaabe Algonquin. Dear participants, a year ago, the Africa Study Group and the Middle East Institute jointly conducted a webinar on the geopolitical situation in the Sahel region following the withdrawal of French forces from Mali. As part of the discussion, we looked at the implications of this withdrawal, its impact on the countries of the region, and on the other forces, in particular the UN missions in Mali and the G5 Sahel Regional Force. We mentioned the confluence of events that has heightened global security concern as countries in the region continue to struggle with a litany of related economic and governance crises, including extreme poverty, migration, food insecurity, and climate change. We also discussed the changing jihadist threats facing the Sahel region and the emergence of new epicenter of violence in areas of the Sahel itself, as well as in West, Central, and East Africa. The speakers then explored the implications of these events for the balance of power in the Sahel, and also explained the geopolitical and security interconnection between the Sahel region and between the Sahel region and North Africa, particularly Libya. Today, 1 year after our last panel discussion, the worsening political instability in the Sahel is attracting increasing attention and concern from the international community. In September 2022, UN Secretary General Guterres declared that the situation is extremely urgent. Insecurity and political instability in the Sahel continue to worsen an already catastrophic humanitarian situation. In some regions, the state has lost all access to the population. Non-state armed groups are consolidating their deadly grip on the region and are even seeking to extend their presence to the countries of the Gulf of Guinea. He concluded, let's be clear, the security crisis in the Sahel is a global threat. If nothing is done, the effect of terrorism, violent extremism, and organized crime will be felt far beyond the region of the African continent. An urgent and coordinated international response is needed. Fin de citation. This webinar will address the challenges and prospect of such an international response to the multidimensional crisis facing the Sahel. The webinar will be moderated by Madam Intisar Fakir, my dear sister Intisar Fakir, Senior Fellow and Director of the North Africa and Sahel Program of the Middle East Institute. Intisar is an expert on North Africa, the Sahel, and key regional thematic issues, including governance, social change, migration, and security. She has written extensively on North Africa and North Africa's evolving politics, including Islamic electoral politics in post-2011 Morocco and Tunisia, the Western Sahara issue, foreign policy priority in Morocco and the broader region, and the impact of COVID-19 on regional political stability. Her research has also included political transitions, mobilization trends, energy, and social change in Morocco, Mauritania, Algeria, and Tanzania. Today, we have three speakers. Ambassador Peter Pham, who joined the Atlantic Council as a distinguished fellow in March 2021, after concluding public service as U.S. Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region of Africa and U.S. Special Envoy for the Sahel region with a personal rank of ambassador. He had previously been Atlantic Council Vice President for Research and Regional Initiative and Director of the Council's Africa Center. Prior to joining the Atlantic Council in 2011, he was a Senior Vice President of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and editor of its journal, American Foreign Policy Interests. He served on the Senior Advisory Group of the United States Africa Command from 2008 to 2013. From 2008 to 2017, he also served as Vice President of the Association of the Study in the Middle East and Africa and was founding editor-in-chief of the Journal of the Middle East in Africa. I should mention that Ambassador Pham is the author of more than 300 texts and the author, editor, and translator of over a dozen books, including most recently Somalia, Fixing Africa's Most Failed States. Ambassador Pham is the recipient, and that's important to be mentioned. He is the recipient of several honors and awards from African countries, including Commander of the National Order of Mali, Commander of the National Order of Burkina Faso, Officer of the National Order of Merit of Niger, Commander of the National Order of Merit of Gabon, and Commander of the Order of the Friendship of Peoples of Burundi. Welcome, Ambassador. Our second speaker is Dr. Laurie-Anne Thérault-Benoni. Laurie-Anne Thérault-Benoni is the Regional Director of the Institute for Security Studies, West Africa, Sahel, and Lake Chad Basin Office. She is based in Dakar, Senegal. Previously, Laurie-Anne worked as a researcher on peace and security issues at the Peace Operation Network of the University of Montreal. She also developed various projects related to peace operation, mainly in New York and Addis Ababa. Laurie holds a PhD in anthropology. Her dissertation focuses on media, conflict, and democratization in Côte d'Ivoire, where she conducted regular field research between 2003 and 2011. Her latest research project focuses on the certification of post-conflict electoral processes by United Nations, with a particular focus on Côte d'Ivoire. Bienvenue, Laurie. Jonathan Wiener, our third speaker, was the United Nations States Special Envoy for Libya, responsible for developing, coordinating, and implementing US policy in Libya. He previously served as the US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Law Enforcement and as the first General Secretary of the Global Forum on Corruption. Weiner also served for 10 years as consul to US Senator John Kerry, as well as a regulator attorney specializing in national security law and cross-border regulation. He has written and lectured widely on national security and foreign policy, human rights, international money laundering, sanction, corruption, and the legal implication of globalization. In 2016, I should mention, he received the highest award granted by the Secretary of State for extraordinary service to the United States government. Without further delay, I will now hand over to our moderator. Intisar, je vous laisse la parole.
Merci, Sheikh. Thank you very much, Sheikh. Thank you to our audience for joining us, and thank you to our speakers. I want to dive right into our questions, but just a very quick reminder that as we are going through our discussion, our participants, you can also submit your questions through the Q&A function. So for any questions you have, please go ahead and put them in, and we will get to them towards the latter part of the conversation. With that, I want to start with you, Laurie. I'd like to come to you for maybe a kind of a broad picture, a state of play of Sahel security in the aftermath of a lot of the dynamics and developments that Sheikh has mentioned. You know, we've talked about French withdrawal, we've talked about the restructuring of French engagement in the region, but also, you know, the future of the G5 Sahel force and the presence of Wagner. These are all themes that we have kind of been talking about a little bit. You know, where are these themes today?
Thanks very much for the floor. And I think it's important, as you highlighted those recent developments, to situate this conversation not only in relations to these recent developments, but also in the context of the larger past decade of multiple military and security interventions that have not managed to reverse the course of insecurity. I think it's important to remember, and if you look at maps of insecurity from 2012 to now, 2022, you will see the insecurity starting in Mali and then expanding onto Niger and Burkina. And as of 2018, 2019, the north of coastal states are also concerned, which means that if this trend continues, in the next decade, no West African countries will be spared. And I think it's important to remember that, because if we look only at the recent development, withdrawal of Barkhane, withdrawal of G5, coming in of Wagner, we might lose those important dynamics. Before Mali decided to reach out to Russia in November 2021 for support, before Mali withdrew from the G5 in 2022, and before French troops completed their withdrawal from Mali in August 2022, and redeployed to Niger, the security situation was already dire and had been worsening for almost a decade. So instead of a new geographic focus, moving a deployment from one country to the other, what might be needed is a thorough review that could help identify lessons from the past decade of intervention. And what is striking is that there has been limited public acknowledgement that the strategy that was implemented in the Sahel might not have been the right one, might have been inadequate. So I think it's important to perhaps highlight a couple of shortcomings. And among those that are striking is obviously the heavy focus on defeating terror groups, mainly militarily, by neutralizing their leaders or their heads without a clear thought-through plan to address local concerns and vulnerabilities. Other mistakes include forging alliances with non-state armed groups, stigmatizing specific communities in the process of doing counterterrorism, but also giving little priority to protection of civilians, which ISS research shows is a key driver for people to join. Over the past few years, we've been conducting hundreds and hundreds of interviews with individuals who found themselves involved in violent extremist organizations. And it's striking to see that joining is often the result in a context where there is only limited other options. It's an option to protect yourself, to protect your family, to protect your community, or to protect your income generating activities. And so the issue of protection and the capacity of military operation, whether they are conducted by national or international forces, to provide that protection is a key dimension that has not been taken into account enough. And the lessons have to be learned if we are to make sure that we don't repeat costly mistakes. Underlying the question that you pose is a desire, obviously, to assess whether the situation has improved or deteriorated over the past year with all the specific events that we have highlighted. And to do so, it's important to get firsthand data from the field. But in the current context of heavy political bias, political sensitivities, and let's face it, also propaganda from all sides, it's becoming increasingly challenging to conduct field research, to access stakeholders in a context that was already, as I mentioned, difficult from a security perspective. And so we need to be extremely careful about depicting the situation as either black or white. And our work shows that, in fact, there are a lot of the situation would be better described as having several shades of gray. I'd like to highlight, to perhaps end on this point, to highlight 3 key points in relation to the security situation, but perhaps more in relation to partnerships and strategy. The first one is that Mali's decision to explore new military alliances seemed to reflect dissatisfaction with existing partnership. And I think European and Western partners should assess why this is the case. The response we have seen so far, which mainly consisted in suspending cooperation, will only allow alternative actors to entrench themselves further. What could be proposed in the current situation is a true alternative that not only aligns with Western values, but also appear as efficient and considerate to national priorities. The second point that I would like to make in relation to the withdrawal of French troops is that it is largely presented as a challenge. And let's face it, it is a challenge. It raises all kinds of important questions. But it might be also an opportunity. When engaging with a representative of both EU and non-EU Western countries, Western states, it is striking to note how some of them were quite skeptical of the French approach and quite critical of it. But they did not always find ways to express dissent. Or if they did, then they ended up following anyway in the path that was already presented by France. So with the end of Barkhane, alternative or complementary solutions to the crisis have now the opportunity to not just be explored, but also seriously discussed. The third and last point that I would like to make, and which worries us at the ISS as an African organization that works on security, human security issues, in relations to the Malian transitional government's new partner, it's not just the identity of the actor providing military assistance, but the fact that the strategy implemented so far still relies predominantly on the use of force and on an understanding that military victory against terrorism is possible. As I said, for many, many years, we've been documenting the complex ways in which terrorist groups gain funding, operational means, and human resources. by tapping into local vulnerabilities. And we have been looking at what motivates people to join or leave these groups and the circumstances in which they do so. Our findings in the Lake Chad Basin, in the Sahel, in coastal countries indicate, as I mentioned, that while security and military solutions are indispensable to ensure community protection, they're insufficient to achieving lasting peace. An alternative as well as complementary approaches to the use of force that include incentive for defection, tackling supply chains, tackling funding schemes, disrupting funding mechanism are just as critical to weaken these groups operating in West Africa. Not to mention, obviously, preventing intervention that seek to improve political, social, and economic governance. And let me end here on the word governance, because I think this is probably the key word and the key dimension to be worked on if we are to find lasting solutions.
Thank you, Laurie. I want to follow up with you on something that you mentioned, which is this sort of reluctance, I think maybe globally, but also regionally, if I understood you correctly, to kind of take stock and understand where a lot of these strategies and sort of talk about the failure of these strategies. What is driving that reluctance? What is pushing that reluctance? Why is that there?
I think no one likes to talk about when they fail. I think everyone likes to talk about what they did that was brilliant and successful. And so I think this is, and I see colleagues laughing on the screen, but I think especially for diplomatic actors, I think no one is willing to openly just highlight everything that they did that was wrong in their career or in their strategy. So I think this is part of the issue. And obviously in more private conversations that we've had with a range of actors at the ISS, this comes out. So in private settings, this is being discussed, and there is an acknowledgement that what was done in the Sahel was not always the best approach, but doing so publicly is something that very few states are happy to do currently. So I would, the short answer would be to keep faith, and especially in a context for some countries that are also the former colonizers who have been leading the strategy for various other actors. I mean, this is a key dimension to have in mind.
Thank you, Laurie. This is a good segue on to you, Peter, and to talk a little bit about U.S. engagement in this area. What is U.S. engagement in the Sahel at the moment? And then more broadly, if you can kind of step back also a little bit and talk about give us a little sense of what is the combined impact of all of these global developments as well on some of these Sahelian countries, adding another layer to what Laurie was talking about in terms of regional and domestic developments.
Well, thank you very much, and for the opportunity to engage in this discussion with you and with my colleagues. If I can pick up just where Laurie Ann left off. It's not, I would make the argument that it's not so much lessons learned, so much as a little bit of I told you so on the part of numerous actors who early on saw the problem, and we knew the problem a decade ago. It just took some people longer to recognize the reality. I'm struck with two texts, if you'll indulge me a little bit. On the day before the French intervention in Opération Serval into Mali, in the Journal du Dimanche, former Prime Minister Dominique de Villepin wrote a op-ed which I thought was pretty much spot on. And if I may quote, "In Mali, none of the conditions for success are met. We will fight blindfolded, absent a clear objective for the war. Stopping the southward advance of the jihadists and retaking the north, eradicating AQIM bases are all different wars, and we will fight alone, absent a reliable Malian partner." That's 13th January 2013. Same day I published a piece, and if you'll indulge me, it must be recognized the Malian crisis had its roots in politics, or rather the failure of politics. There's no denying that Al-Qaeda linked extremists in northern Mali, their local allies, and assorted militants and the other criminals they're attracting represent a very real threat to international security. However, the way to deal with that danger is through a measured strategic approach that is likely to achieve a sustainable solution than the current headlong rush to war. So the analysis, for those who was there, it was ignored, and that's a different question, why it was ignored. But it wasn't that it took us 10 years to learn these lessons. They've been learned from earlier conflicts, I think, which leads me to the course that I tried to, when I was appointed the first US Special Envoy for the Sahel, tried to execute a course correction, to which I would say, in all honesty, partially successful, but partially for want of time, not entirely complete. And that was a course correction to prioritize the deepening of partnership with regional partners as the only path to improving political and security situation in the Sahel. And I came to this for three reasons. First, sustainability. The United States learned the hard way in the country of my ancestors, Vietnam and elsewhere, and other colonial powers and other places, that to ensure progress in peace and security, it has to be driven by local and regional institutions. That's the condition sine qua non. And so a US approach to the Sahel has to work through African institutions and West African partners to address the drivers of insecurity, to contain the violence, and to stabilize the region. Now, part of that has been carried over into the Biden administration's strategy for sub-Saharan Africa and its national security strategy, although the particulars of execution perhaps still remain to be worked out. So sustainability. And sustainability is why I was also insistent when I was special envoy that there had to be a strategic review of the United Nations integrated stabilization mission, Mali, MINUSMA. And it existed for nearly a decade without a strategic review. And to get that strategic review was like pulling teeth when one is not a dentist. Quite frankly, it was down to the wire in 2020 as we were in the middle of a pandemic, and it took a veto threat to get the strategic review included in the renewal resolution. It was that difficult. The review, and to write specific language that the contents of the review were to be given to the Security Council in total, not some polarized version. But I think those have never been officially released, but copies have circulated, and I'm sure many on this discussion today have seen that and are not surprised by the conclusion drawn. I think a disappointment might be that more has not been made of that. Part of it is because events have already taken their course with the withdrawal of the French Operation Barkhane and other developments. But still, I think there are parts of that strategic review that are worth exploring in more detail, having to do with force composition and why it is that that mission is so unpopular, and what were the untold stories of its foundation, and we can get into that. Second reason why it's important, I think, to prioritize regional partners, local institutions, is a matter of coordination. Following the lead of African organizations and initiatives is the most effective coordinating mechanism for the various disparate international efforts. I'm sure Jonathan will have similar experiences, but I had a diplomat on my, a European diplomat who was an exchange diplomat on my staff in the State Department. And one of his responsibilities was to keep what started as one sheet of paper, and by the time I left office, it became 4 sheets of paper updated on my desk, so I could keep straight the various coordinating mechanisms and who belonged to which, and the various straight lines and dotted lines, so that when I was engaging in conversations with counterparts, I could keep things straight, because there's as we know, the reason there's a difference between the Coalition for the Sahel and the Sahel Alliance, although in English, those two are relatively synonymous terms, and the various bodies and to me, it never made much sense, the creation of a supranational body, which of course would simply take business away and relevance from the existing G5 Sahel and its secretariat. So I think that coordination and de-conflictuation just of support structures was necessary. One aspect of US policy I will highlight that I'm gratified, we initiated it in my time as Special Envoy, but it continues in the current administration, is to dual accredit our ambassador, the United States ambassador in Nouakchott, not only as ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Mauritania, but also as representative of the United States to the Secretariat of the G5 Sahel, that level of engagement there. And the third reason why it's so important to prioritize in our strategy and approach these local institutions is a term that I took as a political scientist. It is familiar to me and to others political scientists, but in the language of diplomacy sounds very, very different. And it took me a great deal of arguing and internecine fights to clear the term and be allowed to use it. Is the term crisis of state legitimacy. It sounds different to an academic than it does to a diplomat, but I think the fundamental driver of conflict in the Sahel is that, and the only path to sustainable stability in the long term is having states that are willing and able to provide some basic protections, basic services to their population. We have to acknowledge the sacrifices in Operation Barkhane, MINUSMA, Takuba, and other internationally driven interventions that have had their role in protecting civilians. But these successes are inevitably short-term. They give us some time, some space, but that time and space has to be used to address those gaps and governance challenges, which are critical. On this point, I will wrap up by making one little observation, and this has to do with our preoccupation, fixation, if you will, with the presence of outside malign actors, the Wagner Group in Mali and other places in the Sahel. If we're being honest, as Lorianne called us to be, and I endorse that, we have to acknowledge also the role that policy made by Western governments enabled them to have their entree. They're opportunists. How did Wagner get into the Central African Republic? It was the refusal of the former colonial power to provide protection for the internationally recognized head of state. He wanted security. Perhaps he wanted too much, but that's a different issue. In Mali, how did they get in? And here, I think the United States has to acknowledge its own responsibilities beyond the issues that the current government has with the former colonial power. Now, when I was Special Envoy, after the events of August 2020, we declared that what had happened was a coup. It was. And there are consequences under US law for coup d'etat. That includes the cutoff of security assistance programs. It's a matter of US law, the Leahy law, and it's a matter of our values as a republic and a democracy. And I support those. We declared those and we ceased direct assistance on the security realm with the government. But that's for assistance. The law provides for assistance. It does not it is not a blanket ban on engagement. We continue certainly politically engaging them, but also is not a blanket engagement. We should take things not as dogma or doctrine, but on a case-by-case basis. Even before the coup, the Malian government was looking to buy a second transport plane for its military. They put aside money, they were going to purchase it. They had one that was overdue for maintenance. A miracle didn't fall out of the sky previously. After the coup, once they had settled in, they were military men. They understood the need for this. They began the process and they had secured a contract to purchase one manufactured by Airbus in Spain. But what they needed was a license from the United States for the export of one critical part. And it wasn't a weapon, it was the military grade transponder, a security device, an identification device. The current US administration, despite intercession by a number of experts and the Mali foreign minister, refused the license for the sale. Now, this is not a military part. This is not a military weapon. It's not a lethal assistance. It's a purchase on which we could have placed conditions, human rights, training, engagement, but Dr. said no. At the end of the day, the Malian foreign minister Diop, came to Washington in August 2021 to beg for a review of the decision. He was refused. The next month at the United Nations General Assembly, he spoke with all 5 permanent members of the Security Council, including the Russian Federation. And Foreign Minister Lavrov said, well, come to Moscow. We have planes and we have other things. And the rest is history. So we have to acknowledge that we have to be more nuanced. It's nice to be at one's moral high horse sometimes, but that also contributes. So, and I'll stop there, but thank you.
Peter, you bring up an excellent point, and I want to follow up with you on this, the sort of practical considerations that sometimes drive this kind of outreach and engagement that tends to be missed. Do you think that there is, do you think that there are lessons that this sort of experience might change foreign policy a little bit, or might kind of add a little bit more of the pragmatism that you were talking about? Do you see any signs of that, or do you think the discourse will continue to be fixated on the presence of Wagner, whereas the engagement is, playing out a little bit differently?
Well, I think after Mali, of course, was the first coups. You can count them depending on how you want to parse them, 1 or 2 coups. And then, of course, Burkina Faso followed. And now, of course, Guinea, Conakry, continuing in the same region and heading out to the sea. And I would say, without going too far in this particular, I would say that I think I have to give the administration credit to having learned, if you will, although it may not admit it publicly, I think there are some lessons learned. And certainly the level of engagement with the regime in Conakry is much different than the level of engagement that was carried out with Mali after I left office. While I was still special envoy, despite the coup, despite the designation of the coup, I still met with the regime and worked on specific things that we could work on together and within those limits. And I think that's certainly been the case more with Guinea. So I think we've learned a few things along the way. And I was just in Guinea myself just a month ago, my 4th visit in a year. And, we will see, as always, trust but verify, as Ronald Reagan once said. But I think there are some hopeful signs that engagement, and it's not just the United States, but I notice also our French friends are also much more engaged, and some of our regional actors, including the Moroccans, were also engaged. So let's, in a way, no experiment is perfect. This is social science, not physical science, but I think there's some compare and contrast exercise that's going to be done in future years.
And we'll come back. We'll talk a little bit more about regional actors as well. And I think this is a segue into one of maybe the bigger ones, into Jonathan, talking to you a little bit about Libya and the sort of Maghreb Sahel links in terms of not just security, but also governance and the role of the Libya conflict, the impact of this, protracted crisis beyond just the borders of Libya. How do you see that playing out in the Sahel?
First of all, Libya has provided a lovely base for the Wagner Group to move on out south of Libya. It established itself in Libya first before it moved south into the Sahel. And Russia is opportunistic. And boy, have we given them opportunities in Africa. In 2019, President Putin convened a Russia-Africa summit. He brought in heads of state. He said, I'm going to give you grain and food and fertilizer. I'm going to give you security support. And he designated various lieutenants to go into Africa and to provide African governments what they needed. Human rights, not so much on the agenda. Legitimacy, not so much on the agenda. We'll deal with whomever is there. And Russia has, for the past 4 years, been good building on that. They did the same thing in Libya in early 2016, when a fragile Libyan government that had been painstakingly negotiated into existence with Russian support pretty quickly became challenged by a warlord, Khalifa Haftar. And Khalifa Haftar's first move as a warlord was to get support from Russia in the form of $12 billion. Actually, it was 12 billion Libyan dinars, which is more than that in US dollars, I think, to do with whatever he wanted and whatever the Eastern people who's in the east of Libya who still didn't want to be part of the UN brokered government might want. And that played a fundamental, not a secondary role in keeping Libya from able to move forward and consolidate a state and move to elections, because it was a revenue stream created out of paper, not quite out of thin air, about the Russian state printer, cost almost nothing. And that allowed a warlord to eventually attack the capital. And what Russia got out of it immediately was a base. And that base, Al Jufra, is a base that they can then use to move men down to. And then from there, they can move them down further south. So one point that I would make that's security related, and I agree with nearly every word of my predecessors who really know the situation remarkably well. And I want to go back to the point about coordination. And I want to go back to the point about the need to provide break up revenue streams and supply chains on the one hand to the horrific actors, but you also have to create them and build them and strengthen them for potential good actors. I want to talk more about that, because the provision of services on the ground is going to be critical to a solution. And one of the things that's happened in this fragmented Libya, which has been fragmented in part with the help of Russia and to some extent the Emirates and their junior partner for this perspective, I shouldn't say it publicly, but it's true, Egypt, is they've seen the potential of denying revenue streams to their opponents in oil, and the Emiratis have helped to finance this fragmentation. Then locally, you get people who've got their own militias, their own forces, and whether they're terrorist or paramilitary, whether you want to call them left, right, green, pink, put any color you want on them or any part of the political spectrum, what they're really about, to go back to Laurie's point, is they're really about providing security and incomes to young men who otherwise are going to be unemployed, as well as physically insecure. So the militia problem gets to be a really big problem in states that are badly governed. So from my point of view, the first thing, I'm going to try and do the 3 points thing that Laurie did so effectively, the end of her statements, is I do think you have to get the Wagner group out. And it is pronounced Wagner because they were named actually because of one of the founders' buddies liked to play Tannhauser when he would go into battle. That's the apocryphal and maybe true origin of the name Wagner. In any case, Russia is not just opportunistic, but it is, from my point of view, malicious, because it will do deals with anybody in return for getting raw materials and votes in the UN. And it doesn't give a damn about the well-being of the people of the countries. Simply doesn't care. Human rights certainly does not matter. Corruption is to be exploited. I'm not a lifelong anti-Russia person. I've come by my current point of view on Russia over 40 years and spending a lot of time working with Russia, trying to get it to a better place. And now almost 20 years ago, 15 years ago, saying, I can't deal with this place anymore. It's just too much of a mess. It's going to a very bad location. This was about 2007, 8. So the Wagner Group needs to be pushed out. They need to be pushed out through a consolidated approach by other countries, but they're still going to be in the UN Security Council, which gets me to the next point, which is the UN is not in a good state. Guterres has been repeatedly humiliated in any number of situations, personally humiliated. He was in Libya when Haftar decided to invade Tripoli. He has been in other situations. And it's a terrible situation for him to be in, where he doesn't control, where he doesn't operate with the United Security Council, but one that is constantly undermining him. This takes us to the Brits, who are dealing with their own problems post-Brexit and are not the colonial, even post-colonial force they once were, which has helped motivate the Emiratis to try and become the regional power in Eastern Africa. Take a compass, put the point in Abu Dhabi, draw a circle, that's their sphere of influence. Withdrawing imperial power, and then they look at us in the United States and say, no, they're withdrawing imperial power. They couldn't even hold on to their base in Afghanistan. They spent 20 years building and investing in, that just disappeared under Biden from the Emirati point of view, as well as from the Russia point of view. So another declining imperial power. So the Brits are gone, the Americans are gone. What, the French are gone now too? Okay, great, tremendous opportunity. So my point of view is there needs to be a strategy to get Wagner Group out of Russia and Wagner Group out of Africa. And then there needs to be attention to what Russia's been providing Africa, which is security, some security support and fertilizer and grain. What other country has been paying attention to that adequately? Guterres provides attention to it, but none of the so-called superpowers or big responsible actors are. And then you get to the massive number of regional problems, which I wrote down before this. I'm going to just run through. You ran through them at the very beginning of this, but civil wars, legitimacy, repression, militias, domestic extremism and terrorism, the Islamic State and AQ, etc., cross-border terrorism, as well as domestic terrorism, migration, displacement, refugees, food insecurity, youth unemployment, national resource looting and corruption, national resource depletion, and climate change, sanitation problems, water stress. Okay, so if you can find somebody who's going to deal with youth unemployment, food and water insecurity, refugees and displaced people, I'll go to that person. I'll give that person my support. That person deserves my support. Now I want to switch to something else that Peter talked about, which is the question of regional organizations as opposed to the foreign powers. Secretary Kerry, early on when I started working on Libya, with inadequate background to do the job, but I guess everybody has an inadequate background except for Peter, because Peter really doesn't have an inadequate background to do what he was doing. But I felt it. What Kerry said to me is, Jonathan, what do you think you're going to be doing 2 years from now? I said, probably Libya. How about 4? I said, well, if I'm very lucky or very unlucky, maybe still Libya. He said, how about 8? You're going to be doing 8 for years from now? I said, no way. My health won't tolerate it. I'll be too old, and it's too long to do for anybody. You do 3 years if you're foreign service. He said, well, they'll still all be there. The Egyptians will still be there. The Algerians will still be there. The Nigerians, the Chadians, Moroccans, they'll all still be there. You won't be there. So you better build local, regional support for what you're doing if you want to have any chance of success. It was a very valuable message. And envoys spend most of their time doing alignment. How many people can I get lined up going the same direction? Deconfliction and alignment to try and create an integrated policy. And Ambassador Fan made this point, I thought, really well. That's the core work. But it also has to be locally based and make sense locally. I've seen policy go wrong so many times when Washington has one idea and the actual region that Washington's supposed to be affecting has a completely different idea, all the local actors. And when they stay different, nothing that Washington does will work. So you have to come to understand it, respect it, and then figure it out. So I'm going to go back to this main point, which is who's got the solutions for youth unemployment, food and water insecurity, and refugees and displaced people, and who can be incentivized to act to address these issues. That's my big question. The person with the answer, thank you. Thank you. What can I do to help you? And then I want to go back to security. What are the right mechanisms of security? Who's going to engage on a regional level to address security? Now, the G5 Sahel obviously is part of it, but then you've got these institutions like ECOWAS, you got the African Union. Who's going to be in the lead and act as the integrator? President Obama got criticized for talking about leading from behind, but in some cases, it really makes sense for the United States not to be the lead actor. It's not going to be the lead actor in implementation. And if we can help find ways to get regional institutions functioning to do integrated action to address core issues, that would be a really, really, really good thing. Nature abhors a vacuum. The Russians have been filling the vacuum, so the Emiratis to the east. And they're not necessarily always the right solutions, the Russians, and perhaps the Emiratis or the Qataris for that matter. I don't have a dog in that particular fight one way or the other. I would just like to see the region provide security for people, jobs for young people, food, water, electricity, and basic security. And it's going the wrong way. So if I was an envoy in a job like Peter's job, I'd be trying to talk to people locally as much as possible as to who's best situated to address these core issues on the economic side and on the humanitarian side, even as we continue to work the political side. And on the security, I'd be trying to say to myself, who really is in a position to take the lead and to act as an integrator function rather than a unilateral function. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Peter, let me come to you and maybe to kind of carry that question forward. What can regional organizations, African organizations, institutions do on these issues, security, governance, and also the type of transnational threats and challenges that Jonathan highlighted? Who can do what, if you can just kind of tick off some ideas?
Thank you very much. My general default setting, if you will, is to begin with whatever institution is at the lowest level that can carry out the task efficiently. It's not so we shouldn't be doctrinaire and say it has to be the African Union or it has to be ECOWAS, but which is closest to the situation. So in the Sahel in particular, my reference point has always been where it is possible, where they can be supported and effective, it should be at the level of the G5. Now, granted, the G5 was announced almost a decade ago. It took them a number of years to first stand up, create the standby force, and then first commander was not the most effective. The second one was actually quite an improvement. Took them a long time to set up the secretary, but they finally slowly, it took a while. And, you know, patience is rewarded. But just, unfortunately, just by the time they set up this executive secretary in Nouakchott, the patience of some former colonial powers had snapped, and they started very quickly creating institutions that took the momentum away. And that was part of the problem that I tried to address by kind of putting the brakes on movement in that direction. But so in general, that would be my is stay as close and local as possible, and as a general rule. And in some cases, it's going to have to be at the national level and even the subnational level. And we have to get comfortable with engaging. And one of the tasks is to break out of our default setting. I think as diplomats, the default setting is very often to talk to like talks to like. So diplomats like to talk to diplomats, which means we go to capitals, but engaging. My general rule is when I operated, whether as a special envoy, whether in the Sahel, was I would speak to anyone as long as they didn't have literal blood of Americans on their hands. I was prepared to talk to anyone. And that included in Mali, talking to some people that, you know, I called on Imam Abu Diko at his home and spent hours with him. Now, there's very little that he and I probably would agree with other than being civil on an ideological, but he is a person of influence, and I have no issue with engaging with them. And I think that's what we have to do is also, because very often actors are not necessarily going to be other diplomats. It's going to be who has moral suasion. In Mali, again, the Sheikh of Nioro is someone I would advise anyone to engage with who is interested in affecting and getting a finger on the pulse of people, and other, civil society and others have to be brought into, because of the crisis of legitimacy we spoke about earlier. In many respects, the government actors, certainly you have to engage with them, but they may not necessarily be the most legitimate actors or even have the best data available. So I think we have to learn to get out of our comfort zone and cast the net as widely as possible, because in this, it's at all hands on deck. And if someone is not actively opposed to the objectives that we are seeking, then who's not my enemy is a potential friend.
Great, thank you, Peter. Lori, do you agree with this as well? Go local, stay local, does that?
Yeah, I'd like to react on a couple of points here, since you give me the floor. The first one is on the issue of lessons, whether they're learned, whether they're not learned. I think part of the challenge is also whether there are enough people with shared enough understanding of both lessons and evidence to actually act in a similar direction. And I think this is an additional challenge that we could put to the list. I'd like to react on two key points, which is the issue of regional organizations and military transitions and how to handle them in the current context. The issue of regional organization, and this is when it's perhaps a challenge to have been in the region for so long, because I was among the unpopular voices back in 2013 that said that MINUSMA was perhaps not the best idea. At the time, you will remember there were two options on the table. Option one was to contribute to a mission that was to be deployed, but that was trying to create the condition for external funding through UN-assessed contribution. The mission was called AFISMA in English, the African-led mission in support of Mali. It was the result of a lot of tensions between ECOWAS and the African Union. And then this option was going to have a mandate for counterterrorism. And then option two was MINUSMA with UN-assessed contribution and a parallel force that was in charge of doing counterterrorism, because the UN doesn't like to do counterterrorism and is not equipped to do counterterrorism, and was going to take care of the peace process. And at the time, it's the second option, the one we're in, that was selected, mainly because the UK and the US didn't want a second AMISOM. So AMISOM being this mission in Somalia that has support packages through UN-assessed contributions. And it's interesting because obviously there were challenges at the time. AFISMA, the way in which it was deployed, there were doubts that it was going to be able to fulfill a counterterrorism mandate. But I think it's important to remember that the option that was put forward by the region and the continent were put aside for reasons, obviously, that we can agree or disagree about, but that are important to remember, because it brings us back to what also led to a challenge for the G5 Sahel, which came about in a context where there had been tension between the AU and ECOWAS, and the response to the situation in the region was thought to be inclusive only if it could also bring in Mauritania, where the political wing of the independentist movement was settled at the time, and Chad, which was perceived as the only country that had the capacity to fight in the desert. And this is how the G5 Sahel came about. Yet the G5 Sahel, as Peter rightly pointed out, faced similar challenges in putting together the joint force. And one of the key challenges was also the funding. So the funding was the problem for AFISMA. It was the problem again for the G5 Sahel joint force, along with other challenges. But the issue of funding African peace and security initiative is one that is not yet that is not yet solved and which will continue as we currently discuss. One organization that has not been mentioned is the Accra Initiative, which is the new kid on the block, which is this initiative that brings together coastal countries, but also former G5 Sahel countries or current ones. And that looks at intelligence sharing and joint operations. So in a similar way than what the G5 is doing, but perhaps with some of the lessons that are learned. And so I'm raising this because it's interesting that we are, again, talking about the need for regional organization to take the lead, but we are perhaps at the moment where we have never had such a weak ECOWAS, tensions between various organizations, competition around funding, bilateral relations that are increasingly tense between neighbors that are meant to collaborate together because countries cannot move. And so the issue of regional cooperation is, I think, one of the key challenges that needs to be tackled if we are to move forward in the current context. And the second point that I wanted to discuss is the handling of military transition, because I think Peter raised very important points about how lessons were learned in that specific context and how the way in which Mali was engaged was different to the way in which Guinea is being engaged. And we need to remember that if we stay in West Africa, for Mali, for Burkina, for Guinea, the countries that are currently undergoing coups were already undergoing coups about 10 years from now. 2012 for Mali, 2014 for Burkina Faso, with a political uprising that led to a non-constitutional change of government, and same in Guinea. So what we can perhaps learn as a lesson from that is that the management of transitions, as well as the management of the period that comes after the transition with an elected government, can either cause the basis for stability, economic development, inclusion, and all the rest of it, or prepare the ground for the next coup. And I think this is something that we really need to keep in mind as we manage the transition currently. And obviously, we need to remain within the normative track of calling for a rapid return to constitutional order, but this was tried 10 years ago. So if we don't want 10 years from now to be yet managing another military transition following a coup, we should really, on that point, try and see what can be done, even if it's an uncomfortable option, but try and identify what can be done with these interlocutors that we don't like because they wear military uniforms, but perhaps some options can be explored that are more difficult to pass during normal periods. What could be done that could move some of the processes forward? I think this is a discussion that we don't hear enough and that we should engage on, even if, again, it's counter-normative and very uncomfortable, because it's the only way to make sure we don't prepare the stage for the next coups in the decades or even earlier in a context where we've seen repetitive coups with a couple of months in between.
Laurie, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot here and maybe see if I can get you to answer that question. What can be done? And then I want to turn to Peter as well and see if I can get your feedback on what Laurie has just said.
What do you mean, what can be done?
You said we need to talk to some of these, actors that we don't potentially unsavory, as we call for a return to civilian rule. What can be done during that transition period, working with them? Go ahead.
Let me give you a very concrete example.
Mm-hmm.
In 2014 or 2015 in Burkina Faso, it was during the transition period, a law to depoliticize the civil service. So to make sure that whenever a minister comes to power, he doesn't kick out most of the ministry and puts in his political clientele in. A law to prevent that was drafted, was discussed. And then it was cut in small pieces and put under the carpet, because obviously the people in charge of conducting the transition at the time were all people who saw themselves as potential leaders of the country or possible ministers. And so they had no interest in not being able to bring in their political clientele and if they ever got to power. This is what I mean when I say that sometimes in normal democratic context, it might be difficult to actually pass some laws that could be progressive. It's not to say that military coups are fantastic opportunities. Don't get me wrong, eh? But it's just that we, in fact, don't really have a choice. The coups that we're in have been lasting for Mali for more than 30 months, more than 16 for Guinea, and more than 15 for Burkina, if I'm not mistaken. So we're not into short transitions anymore. We can continue to just call for short transitions, but it's not happening. And we might, in fact, be in a situation where the current leadership, even when we have elections, have prepared the ground for them to be the next interlocutors. So we can continue to wait, or we can try and see what can be done. And small examples like this law, which has just been passed 3 weeks ago in Burkina Faso, in the context of the transition, a law to depoliticize the civil service. So we need to obviously face the challenge. It is a challenge, but perhaps also seek what are the small opportunities that can make a difference when we come back to a period that might be what we consider a new normal, but with frameworks, with regulations, with laws that can frame the way in which governance is handled in a more productive way, and having in mind general interest and not specific interest of a political elite or a military elite.
Peter?
I would just, I would agree with everything that Lauriane has said. And I would just add, we have to enlarge the aperture when we evaluate these things. Look, I'm not trying to be an apologist for coups. In general, they cause more harm than good most of the time, but one has to understand them. Take the case of Guinea, we've been talking about, and maybe that detaches us from our immediate Sahel discussions, makes it a little easier. The elections that came after the previous set of coups that Lauriane talked about, that election was, and this is a country I have lived in, worked in, no one is ever going to convince me about how mathematically the election result was arrived at. It just makes no sense. So the election, in quotation marks, in 2010, to me, was a question mark, but the international community accepted that. The 2015 election was, I don't think anyone with a straight face could make an argument that that met any of our normal standards for what an election should be. And then on top of it, we have this phenomenon, which is unfortunately an increasing phenomenon in the region of third terms by resetting the count, because you've made some minute change to the constitution. Therefore, the two-term limit count begins all over again. And then, so if you don't, the point is, again, not to say the countries don't have a right to change their constitutions, but if you make it well nigh impossible, prohibitively impossible for people to vote you out of office one way, they will find another way to remove you. And that, not to justify coups, to be very straight, but to say that we have to understand what is going on. And then in that context, without signaling that we condone coups or work with what we have and perhaps affect some changes which may make that the probability of a future coup slightly less. And I think that's the type of pragmatism. There, you know, policymakers, departments of state, foreign ministries like neat rules because then they can apply consistently. That's the nature of government bureaucracy. On the other hand, I think each of these countries has a unique history, and it bears keeping in mind that history rather than trying to squeeze everything into an easy solution. So I don't offer an easy solution other than to say I think we should see a lot of nuance, work with that, and be pragmatic about it, because ultimately these decisions do come at costs, and the costs, unfortunately, are often borne by those who have the least input into these decisions.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up the point Peter made, which is going to the institution at the lowest possible level, that's most local, which is a good reason to support the G5 Sahel in this instance, which is also the oldest engaged institution at this point, even if it's been slow in coming. But there are, after all, three traditional strands that you have to address. There's the political, there's the security, and there's the economic. I'm not sure in the case of the Sahel, I'd be very interested in your thoughts on this, that dealing with one is necessarily going to immediately have an impact, unfortunately, on the other two. I think they each have to be looked at separately in addition to the ways in which they intertwine or are connected. And that takes me to a fourth one, which I would add in, which is the environment. Because in a degrading environment, that affects the political, the security, and the economic every single day that it isn't addressed. And that then takes me back to something that when I was younger, I would roll my eyes at when people would say, give it to USAID. USAID will, in the long run, make a difference. Well, the long run was way longer than I ever had the time and the patience for, because it would be measured in decades before you would find out it hadn't worked. It would measured in decades before you would find out it hadn't worked, just to reemphasize. So the question becomes, what can you do in the short term is going to help people in very particular locations that are critical nodes that could be potentially nodes of virtue, or otherwise nodes of serious problems, and finding particular localities. And here I'm talking about down to cities or border areas where you can make a difference on the environment. May begin also to give you some potential ideas on revenue streams that can be created that would be virtuous rather than vicious. So I'm going to stop there.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. I want to pick up a couple of audience questions before we close. I've got a couple. I'll just sort of read them out, and then you can come in as you know, if you feel you have an answer. The first one I have here is on U.S. engagement. How should the U.S. contribute to a win-win situation by providing alternative options to African countries in the Sahel? How does the U.S. diplomatically also distance itself from EU partners past unsuccessful operations that have been viewed skeptically by recipient countries? Peter, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, certainly. I think we have, there's a balancing act to be sure. The United States is a global power. We have to balance equities, and that includes some of our oldest allies who have their equities, and they may be different from ours, but in any relationship, there's a bit of give and take, whether it be of a couple or nation. So you can't neatly segregate these things. So certainly we have to be sensitive to one of our oldest allies, even if we think they're wrong in this particular region, the Sahel. That being said, however, we also can't write them a blank check. And you know, some of the things Lorianne was talking about, the AFISMA versus MINUSMA debate. If one looks at, quite honestly, at MINUSMA, one of the reasons it's ineffective and thus unpopular is that it was never fit for purpose as a peacekeeping mission. If one looks at deployments, it was fit for purpose as a logistical backstop for a formerly great power that no longer could do what it could do a few decades ago. So it was configured to be a logistics backstop, not a peacekeeping mission. If we're being brutally honest, that's the answer. And so it didn't do the things that peacekeeping missions usually do: protect civilians, provide some services to help capacity build, because it was providing other services to a military power that couldn't do it all on its own. That's the truth of the matter. So I think that's an area where we tried, certainly when I was special envoy, to try to make that distinction. I think it was one that our partners in the region understood and appreciated that engagement, but recognized that we had to also have a balancing act of our own. But I think that it's a tough one. I'm not saying it's easy for anyone, but I think it is necessary to distinguish between the two. And certainly our strength will be that we don't carry, and we should preserve as the United States, that we don't carry that baggage in this particular region. And we should be careful about how we approach the challenge, and it is a challenge. And I agree with Jonathan about we have to get malign actors like the Wagner Group out of there, but to do it in a way that doesn't seem like we're foisting our proxy conflicts into the region. We have to do it with some sensitivity and offer an alternative. It's just not simply say, to these governments, get these troublesome Russians and others out without providing them something on the balance as an alternative. And that includes not just the security side, but very much, as Jonathan has said, I fully agree, the economic side and others aspects of it, which take a far longer lead time. And I will give one little example. For example, on the suspension, we have in our law the necessity for suspending military assistance when coups happen. And I'm in favor of that. But for example, in Burkina Faso, I think some discretionary authority should have been found with respect to the Millennium Challenge Compact. Millennium Challenge Compact, which we signed in 2020 with the democratically elected constitution of Burkina Faso, was a 5-year program to double the number of Burkinabe that had access to reliable, affordable electricity. Taking that away doesn't necessarily punish anyone for staging a military coup. If you're a minimally competent putschist at the head of a junta, you won't need to worry about how you get electricity in your home. Individual householders, though, have that challenge. So I think we have to find the creative ways, and it will take a little bit of argumentation. It won't be uncontroversial domestically, but I think we have to articulate a way past some of the easy solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to read one question that I think is maybe well suited for you, Lorianne, and then I'll let both Jonathan and you also weigh in on previous questions as well. How do outside actors support governance? Is it possible, given international fragmentation and the intervention of other actors who don't seem to care about the quality of governance in the Sahel? So you can answer that, and then also feel free to weigh in on the previous question about U.S. role as well.
I'd like to respond to this one and perhaps also touch upon another one on whether military solutions are indispensable or counterproductive, because I think it's an important one. So I think change in terms of governance has to come from within. There has to be pressure, and there has been popular pressure, as we've seen with popular uprising to call for change. And it can be accompanied by outside. But it cannot be driven by outside actors. And when I say accompanied in the specific context we're in, if we're able to identify within the current transitional governments, the reformists, if I can call them like that, people who have at heart to make changes and in a direction that is for the general interest, then these specific actors can be accompanied, but it first needs to come from within. On the issue of, if you allow me, on the issue of whether, because I said military solutions are indispensable, but they are insufficient. And the colleague in the chat wanted to say that a lot of the analysis also shows that military solution can be counterproductive. And I agree with that. This is why I highlighted that it's not so much the military or security solution in itself, but the way in which it is being implemented. Military solutions need to be calibrated. They need to make sure they don't stigmatize specific communities. The focus should not be only on neutralizing jihadists, but on protecting civilian populations, protecting communities, protecting income-generating activities. So if military solutions are calibrated in that way, have a specific focus, it can contribute, if it's not done alone, to creating the condition for other types of actors to come in with other types of intervention, be they developmental intervention from an economic perspective, from a social perspective, from a political perspective even. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to bring additional nuance to this. You're muted.
Jonathan?
I'm thinking at this moment about what I want to say.
do you want me to throw in the regional question as well, the question of the role of Algeria, and then maybe we can take that as our last question?
Fair enough.
What is the reason Algeria is not involved in regional security initiatives, despite being an important regional player, heavily affected by the security situation on its border within the Sahel? And then we can kind of address everything else through that as well.
To me, Algeria has been so consumed by its internal transition and the question of how it's going to transit from what it's been to some different future, as well as seeing the instability to the east, that it doesn't have a lot of appetite for broader engagement. I think it's always been about respecting national borders, and it limits its role for that reason. Some of its most capable diplomats have not been able to leverage their own government to have Algeria engage in ways that would enable it to be more of a regional player on security matters, where I think in principle Algeria could play a greater role than it has chosen to do in recent years. Of course, it theoretically has a regional counterterrorism center in Algeria, which has never quite gotten off the ground. Yet another institution that doesn't really play much of a role. Algeria is frustrating for me because I would like to see Algeria emerge and move ahead in the same way I'd like to see Libya emerge and move ahead. But meanwhile, we could decry the backsliding in Tunisia if we want to focus on things going the other direction. There's been just an awful lot of bad news lately. And which is why I want to go back to this question of revenue streams. Where can one generate revenue streams that can be used to provide alternatives for young men to being part of militias, part of terrorist groups, extremist groups, to be earning their living by holding guns? Where can you provide jobs that are going to provide alternatives in extraordinarily poor countries that are as reliable as the jobs that they have as being part of a gang? And I don't have an answer to that question, but I see it as a very, very large regional problem that includes Libya, it includes Tunisia, and it is a very broad question. Before Tunisia went south, it had massive youth unemployment, and the North African Sahel regions have really remarkably large numbers of unemployed people under the best of circumstances, unemployed and underemployed. And so strategies for job generation is another important part of the picture, even as governance goes south. I want to go back one last point, going to what Peter's had to say, which is when I was working on Libya, the Leahy Amendment in Leahy language made everything we wanted to do more expensive, more complicated, less efficient, and less able to deliver on things that were in support of American values and universal values. It's a very well-intentioned and important law, but unless waivers are taken advantage of, it can be counterproductive. Having waivers from things that are express best moral principles, not just for military support and security support, but for things like Millennium Challenge are also really important. If you can deliver electrical power and you choose not to for a different reason, that's a bad choice under most circumstances. Occasionally it may be the right choice, but mostly it isn't. And so for figuring out how to deal with our own array of ossified layers of law and regulation in terms of the delivery of US foreign policy and national security objectives goes well beyond the Sahel, but it is one of the things that the US government needs to be looking at. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Peter, do you have any concluding thoughts?
Well, I do think, we've maybe we've depressed everyone with our listing of all the things that have gone wrong and the lessons not learned. But, in the midst of all this, I'd like to conclude giving a shout out, but despite the fact that it has, you can't be blamed for your neighbors, Niger has done remarkably well. We haven't talked much about that. They've managed to maintain constitutional order. The former president, Issoufou, left office after 2 terms and went into retirement. Their neighbors have got Chad, Libya, Mali, Burkina Faso have all gone in various ways and shapes down the path of military takeovers, and they've yet managed to plug along, not perfectly, but plug along. Last year, they managed to eliminate river blindness and certified by, so a number of things. And so the question, though, is they're doing all the right things, could do some more efficiently and better, but what's the reward for doing? It's nice to say, doing the right thing is its own reward, but in a world where, as Jonathan says, one has to worry about youth unemployment and not only as an ends to human dignity, but also to beat back the temptations of extremism. Countries like Niger also need to be incentivized and to see some reward for sticking it through on the right things. So I think that, so I want to give them a shout out for some of the right things they're doing, and then perhaps invitation to engage, with them and to reinforce some of those things.
Great, thank you. Lori, any other bright spots of hope or concluding words before we hand it over to Sheikh?
Yes, not sure it's bright, additional bright light of hopes, but I think we tend to look at the Sahel and see only challenges. And I'm sure you've noticed in the way in which I approach some of those issues that I think we need to really think hard and think out of the box to try and also identify opportunities and seize these opportunities. And we've mentioned some in terms of transitional authorities, in terms of trying to rethink regional organizations or regional cooperation at a moment where it is at the lowest ever. And let me perhaps end on this one. I think the fact that it's difficult now to look at regional responses that would be all-inclusive, we kind of have to look, and when I say we, I'm perhaps now speaking from the perspective of countries in the region. These countries have to look at what it is possible for them to do within their national borders. What is it possible for them to do bilaterally with their immediate neighbors? What can they do on their national territories that can have a transnational impact or an impact at least at trans-border level? And I think this refocus at what can be done, what are the opportunities, ownership of what is being done is perhaps also an important opportunity at a moment where a lot of these countries were looking up at regional level for the solution. It's a good reminder that part of the solution also lies within national borders. And let me perhaps stop here and thank you once more for the opportunity to engage on these complex but important issues.
Thank you, Lori. Over to you, Sheikh. Thank you, everyone.
Merci beaucoup tout le monde. On behalf of Middle East Institute and the Africa Study Group, I would like to thank our panelists for their excellent presentations. Ambassador Peter Pham, Dr. Lori-Anne Terrou-Benoni, Mr. Ambassador Jonathan Wiener. Intisar, merci. Comme toujours, c'était une excellente modération. Many thanks to our partner for this event, the Middle East Institute, Institute in Washington. I would like to thank our colleagues, Mafuya, Communication Director of Africa Study Group, as well as those of Canadian International Council for all the efforts that went into organizing this session. Special thanks to our colleague Faria Nasruddin, Program and Event Manager at the Middle East Institute in Washington, who was vital in organizing this event. The next Africa Study Group webinars will be announced on our website. And we will continue our cooperation with Middle East Institute on this very exciting subject in the Sahara. Nous estimons qu'il y a encore beaucoup de choses à dire et vous avez constaté que cette session était en anglais et nous essaierons pour la prochaine fois de faire de telle sorte qu'elle soit assez bilingue. This will be all for today. I wish you good health, and depending on where you are, a good day, good afternoon, and good night. Merci et à la prochaine. Au revoir.